Retiring by 55, retiring early. It seems like a dream, and it really is. When unfortunately the governments keep pushing out those dates, 65, 67, 70, before you even qualified to start drawing from the public system, it's quite obvious the system wants you to work longer and longer and longer, and they use justifications like, hey, we're all living longer than we ever have. We know that's simply not true. And even if we are living slightly longer, it's only because we're being drawn on by a healthcare system that pumps meds, gives us surgeries, and keeps us trucking along. But when in reality, the health span, or more people are getting ill, more people are dealing with chronic conditions, emphysemas, cancer, leukemia, you name it, heart issues, increased stress levels, have a lot of people acquiring diseases that we never saw years ago. Now, sure, you could say, well, we don't have things like polio and mumps. That's great. But there's other more chronic diseases that are taking over now. And the average age now is only 62, 63. So why on earth would anybody want to work that long? The real question is, how do you retire early by 55 and not be broke by 75? Well, I want to talk about that. And I'm going to get right to it because no point in beating around the bush. The first one is the 4% rule. Everybody talks about the 4% rule, 4% rule. And we know I'm not a financial advisor, never promised to be, never am trying to be. I'm just going by everything I've researched and understood, and quite frankly, I'm living by. Between a 4 to 6% drawdown rate is kind of what I'm looking. Now again, you have to check in on this yourself, but at 4% is pretty typical. Not too many people argue with that. The problem is, not everybody has $1 million in the bank. All of these financial advisors like to paint these pictures about, based on $1 million at 4% and draw down, you make 60 grand, whatever it is a year. It just simply isn't practical, simply not typical, and it's simply doesn't even speak to the vast majority of us. As those that have over $1 million, there might only be 5% or 3% of the population that actually has that type of capital. So even to talk about that is almost pointless. So usually a 4% rule has to be subsidized in some way. So understanding what that plan is. 4% drawdown does get you the distance, right? So what if you only have $100,000 to your name? Okay, so you only take out a few $1,000s a year. Maybe step that up and go $6,000 a year, $500 a month. Maybe you only have 100 grand. Well, you know what? Does that help? Does that top it up? Okay, that's part of the conversation, right? If you're 55, you're too early to take your pension. So other ways, maybe you subsidize, maybe your house is paid off and you don't have debt. Because let's be honest, the 4% rule is only part of the program. The second thing is not going debt. Don't buy a new car. If you're in retirement, even if you're drawing a decent pension, unless it's a significant pension and you're really in a state of, I have no more, my car, there's nothing left. See, this is the second tip that I'd live and buy. I'm not saying never buy a new car. I'm saying buy within your means. And it's never been more important than ever because, let's be honest, cars are the biggest wealth killer ever. And owning a car is okay. It does give you that sense of freedom, does allow you to get out. And, when you're retired, you got errands, you got to visit the doctors, you do your little holidays, pick up the grandkids, whatever it is. I mean, it's nice to get out and about. And so having a vehicle gives you that sense of freedom and the ability to get out there and enjoy your life in other ways. So nobody likes to give up that sense of freedom. And I know, definitely, I would go nuts if I couldn't drive. So that being said, cars are important, but really focus on that. If you could have bought a car before retirement, that's ideal. If you need a car desperately in retirement, maybe focus on a quality used car that's not such a money pit. Maybe buy a Toyota, a Honda, a Lexus, something like that generally aren't going to constantly sap every dollar out of your pocket. And buying used is always a better way to go because the average depreciation for a new car is in 5 years, you're in that 40 to 50% of the value is gone. So getting a car, maybe that's 5 or 6 years old, that's got reasonable Ks, bought from an owner who actually took care of it, that's probably the best approach. But if for some reason you're buying a brand new car, you've got to live well within your means. And as far as I'm concerned, if you don't have the cash to write a check and move on, don't take on payments. Don't have that chew out of your monthly budget. Write the check if you've got that money and it fits within your budget and it's not having a major impact on your lifestyle, so be it. But remember, you will lose money, and cars are the worst investment from that perspective. And once you retire, you really have no other way of getting that back, or very little bit. I mean, most people are simply just holding on to what they've got. A typical 4 or 5% drawdown, plus on top of it, by the time you hit your mid-60s, okay, now you get the public system kicking in. But that being said, most people would agree that taking your public system, that's the next tip, is taking the public system, whether it's, old age security and CPP, or whether it's, the American system, Social Security, and whether you take those younger or older is always a conversation about maybe what you have in your own drawdown. Are you making ends meet on your own 4%? And again, I'm not your financial advisor. I'm not here to really tell you which way to go and how to stage that. But from my perspective, I look at it like in my younger years, I'm more likely to be more active, more go. So I'm probably more likely to adjust my income, my pension, a little heavier on the front end, and then transition more into the public system as time goes on. See, because this is just something that we all have to be thinking about. We have to be actively engaged. That's the other tip. Constant engagement. Look at the plan on a year-to-year basis. This isn't set and forget. This isn't a scenario where you just come up with a plan for the next 25 years and walk away from it. Every year could change. New costs, new expenses come up. So you always have to be looking at where your accounts sit. Where is, are we in a recession? Where is inflation sitting at? And do you have the money and the resources to keep yourself going on? Another tip that I consider you have to think about is healthcare costs. In the US, of course, the public healthcare system isn't quite like in Canada. In Canada, they have a public healthcare system now, sure, to go see a doctor, to go get diagnosed, or get that ailment looked at. That generally is free. But what's not free is when you need to buy meds, or you need to buy glasses or canes or walkers or any of that. None of that's free. So it's a lot more expensive in the US. Yes, you have a procedure, a surgery, delivering a baby, what have you. It all costs a lot of money. And in the US, it's something you really have to be thinking about when you retire, because as we age, our health doesn't get any better. So you have to be thinking about, can I afford to spend on a lot of these healthcare costs? Do I have to have a budget set aside for that? And I know it's a tough reality, but a lot of us have to be thinking about those facts. Burying the head in the sand is not the best approach, and playing more of a reactive approach is not going to help us. If we get sick, if we get ill, things aren't going to be all that well if we don't have money set aside, or if we haven't necessarily planned for it. Now, I also know insurance is a big cost, but that said, maybe pay insurance for 5 or 10 years, get you into the public system by the mid-60s, and then it's not so bad. So thinking about that, how you're going to plan that strategy and putting that money aside, at least to get you for the next 10 years in the private system, to get you to the point where now you're bridged, of course, to the public system. Medicare and Medicaid and all those things is what it takes to make sure that you live comfortably, reliably, and in good shape. Another thing is to have a little buffer. I always like to think 2 to 3 years, maybe even 4 years of your current living style or the cost of living. Now, that seems like a lot of money, but you sort of have to put some of that buffer to the side. Because think about this. If there's ups and downs in the markets, or something changes, or maybe again, something happens, and we won't talk necessarily about the car cost, because I truly believe you've got to have money aside for that in some other way, for car repairs, insurance, and unfortunately in some cases a replacement. But there's other things. Buffers should be looked at. You should have some extra cash, for a rainy day, so to speak, some unexpected issues, repairs, and to put a little bit of extra money in the bank, kind of liquid. Like they say, a lot of people don't even have $1,000 these days for an emergency fund. So if you blow a set of tires, most people are having to put that on the credit card these days. And that's a stressful way to live. And so I know a lot of us live like that. I've had relatives that have kind of lived that type of life, and it's literally day by day, week by week, using one credit card to pay off another credit card to pay off another credit card. And that's such a stressful way to live. So to have a few bucks, maybe a couple of years, 2 to 3 years of buffer in there, it doesn't have to be exact, but just to have a chunk of change in there to sail you through. You don't want to sell your stocks or get involved in that, or having to sell at a low time when stocks that don't have the value. Again, I'm not an investment advisor, but I will tell you, you never want to, as they say, buy high and sell low, right? So having that buffer in there does allow you to sort of, if you need the money, you're not having to sell stocks when times maybe aren't that great. So that's something to think about. Never hurts, even for an emergency fund, to have a little bit of money laying around. That's always a nice to have. On top of it, taxes are another big one. Now, we all pay taxes. That's fine. That's what we do. You know, we all kind of signed up for that the day we started working. We all pay taxes based on our income levels. You know, house taxes, carbon taxes, property taxes, taxes on virtually everything. But it's the income tax portion that we really want to try to affect. And the reason I say that is because a lot of us, you know, with investments, say like in Canada, you know, we have the RRSPs or TFSAs. Some of that is isolated from taxes, some of it is not. And so, again, you've got to figure out what works for you and what kind of investments you have in place. But if you're forced and you've been pushing off some of those big investments like RRSPs or even your 401ks, and you haven't necessarily been worried too much about spending any of it, you get to a point where all of a sudden you're forced to. There's sort of a mandatory date where you actually have to spend it. Now you're stuck paying a maximum tax bracket. It's going to push you into a rate where you have to draw down a big chunk of your income. Maybe that RRSP, you actually have to withdraw that. And sadly, a lot of people get snookered. I know my dad got stuck in a position like that too. He ended up losing his old age security because of, you know, having the RRSPs and dealing with a lot of the, you know, the little bits of investment and pension stuff. Next thing you know, he ended up giving a lot of the system back. A lot of the pensions got clawed back. The last thing you want to do is have that. So the best approach is making sure, again, sitting down with your banker, your financial people, accountants, and understanding how much you need to take each and every year consistently, so you don't get to one position anywhere where you're overpaying on taxes. You want to draw down regularly, consistently, and never be stuck against the wall where you're into that mandatory date. Definitely taxes are going to take a big toll and something you really want to manage. And as I've said, this is something your entire retirement plan has to be something you're looking at each and every year. Other ways to possibly reinvest, ways to kind of turn any kind of dollar into something. Now, you don't have to, the way I see this, turn into an absolute frugal monster. Sometimes I overdo it myself. I've always been a little chintzy. I've always been pretty frugal. And maybe that's part of the reason, it's given me the ability to sort of cut ties with corporate, a little bit earlier than most. But my frugality sometimes plays against me. And, sometimes you say, well, we only live once, and it's easy to say that. And I do agree. At some point, maybe go celebrate, have a dinner out, take the grandkids, go for that walk, go grab an ice cream, and not worried about, each and every penny. I mean, in our earlier years, that's something that we worry about, and we probably should. Like I've always used the term, make hay when the sun shines. And if you don't grind hard when you're younger, it's sure going to be a lot harder when you're older. But see, once we retire, we sort of switch and toggle from that point of spending or saving to all of a sudden now we're a spender. So it's not that you don't spend. Frugal is good, but it's not to all ends, right? The whole idea is spend on quality goods. That's what I like to look at, just quality goods. Less garbage, less crap, less scrap, less stuff to clean up. When I croak, I don't want my kids to have to clean up massive mountains of crap. On top of it, it's also wasted money. You look around the house and all the crap that we attain over the years, and how much of that stuff, if you really think about the value of that retail, of all of that widgets and furniture and things that we have, the value of all of that when it was brand new retail value, then you think about, okay, that was after tax earnings. Then you say at a 30% tax bracket, how much money did I need to gross to pay for all this crap? So I start thinking about all those, and I start putting together this thought in my mind about how much I've actually had to spend. When I start thinking about time versus money and how much time I have to work to actually save that money, it starts meaning a lot more to me. It starts resonating a lot closer. And so frugal is good. But at the same token, at some level, if I am buying goods, I'm just a lot more thoughtful. I'm thinking about the quality. You know, it's not that I'm not spending, but when I do spend, it's going to matter. It's going to have value, and it's going to be of better quality. So instead of buying a cheap suit knowing that I'm going to have to buy another cheap suit in 2 years, I'll just get a cheap suit for now for this wedding, and then I'll buy another one. No, see if you wasted money. Why not buy a better suit right now? Be done with it. Probably be buried in that suit at that point. And again, at some level, the public system kicks in, you start slowing down, and you're just not traveling as much. You start hitting your 70s, it's harder to travel. You also want to be closer to home. And most people just really do not want to go out and about like they did in their 50s. So that's why I'm looking at retirement in my 50s as the best case scenario, and why, in fact, that I've retired early. Because by the time you're in your late 60s, in your 70s, you pretty much ran out of steam. Not interested in going out as much. You certainly don't want to travel as much. And even the sheer costs for insurance, travel insurance and that, a lot of times just simply means that a lot of people just elect not to. By the time they can, they say, no, I'm good, I'm out. I'm not retiring. I can't travel because I can't afford to. So these are the go-go years. And if you want to retire early, it's entirely doable. But those are my tips, and hopefully they help you a little bit, at least point a little bit of a perspective on some priorities when you retire early to make sure that you get the lasting years. You can run the gambit, run the distance without too much stress. Hope to see each and every one of you real soon, everybody. Talk to them. Bye-bye.